Hey guys, welcome to Real Crusades History. So I got a really interesting question. A user asked me if in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, if the kings of Jerusalem could execute anyone that made them angry. I thought that was a great question. I think it really speaks to our perceptions we tend to have about monarchy, looking back at it from the 21st century. And I think even more importantly, it sparks a more interesting question. How was monarchy different in the High Middle Ages as opposed to the Late Middle Ages in Western European society? Because that's really, I think, what we're looking at here. Now, when a lot of us think about monarchy, we tend to think of some of the familiar kings that come to mind. Oh, say Henry VIII of England. Henry VIII was what you would call a tyrant. He was an absolute ruler. He threw a temper tantrum and everybody jumped. He said, "Off with her head," and her head was cut off. And there was really no leeway in terms of his rule, and nobody could really question him. And this is not because monarchy was always like this in Western European Christian society. It wasn't by any means at all. In fact, monarchy went through an evolutionary process. And if we go back to the 12th century, the 13th century, the High Middle Ages, we find that monarchy and kings and their role in the government is very, very different than what we find later on in the late Middle Ages, 15th century, 16th century, and that sort of thing. So how were they different? Well, to answer that question, we have to really look at the origins of Western European monarchy, this tradition. Where did it come from? It really comes from two sources. It comes from the Roman tradition, which Latin Western Europe, was an heir to Roman civilization and Roman law. Roman custom had a huge impact on medieval society there. And also it comes from the Germanic tribal peoples who came to populate Western Europe in the wake of the fall of the Roman Empire and who came to make up the new civilization that we think of when we think of medieval Western European civilization. And these two groups, the Romans and these, quote, barbarian tribes, both had traditions of what we would call today conciliar government. And that is the circle, the governing body that assembles and then makes a decision together. And this is really a tradition that runs pretty deep in Western European heritage. As you go farther east, you tend to see a longer tradition, like in Persia and Asia and Egypt. You see a long, deep tradition of absolutist, supremacist monarchy, but we don't have that in Western Europe. So that's why that period in the late Middle Ages, when you did see that start to happen, was really an anomaly. But if we go back to the early Middle Ages, and especially as we get into the High Middle Ages, we find that kings were not absolute rulers. They did not have absolute power over their people. It's not like they could look at somebody who bugged them and say, "Hey, off with her head," or "off with his head," and it would be done. No, by no means was that possible. And in fact, in the High Middle Ages, executions were far less frequent than they would be in the late Middle Ages. The crime had to be very serious. It had to be something like murder or rape or something like that. But in this period, what we really see is the circle of great men, the council. So in the 12th century, 13th century, and 11th century, what you've got is you do have a monarch in certain regions, not always, and then he has a circle of great men around him. He's got certain dukes, certain bishops, knights, this governing body of men in important positions. And what's going to happen is when there's a major decision that needs to be made, they're all going to assemble and make that decision together. And when you're reading literature from the High Middle Ages, you find this everywhere. There's constantly a reference to, and then the king, gathering all his men together, put the question to them and said, "I'd like you to decide this for me." And this was how it was done. And this is exactly how the Kingdom of Jerusalem in the Crusader states was organized. You had what was called the High Court. And the High Court was made up of a lot of important people like the Count of Jaffa, the Patriarch of Jerusalem, the Archbishop of Tyre, the Count of, or the Prince of Tiberias, the Prince of Kerak, just these different important figures. And it's really like a circle of knights in a lot of ways. There was also clergy on it. But when you think of the legend of Prince Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, think about that. In that situation, you've got King Arthur, and King Arthur has these men around him, and together they assemble at this table, and they make these decisions. And that's kind of how things were done in the High Middle Ages. And it's no surprise that image, that idea of a king and his Knights of the Round Table, came to be the defining myth, the kind of essential mythos of high medieval society, because this image made sense to them, because this is how the world was operated. To kind of give you an example of this, I'm going to read something written by a Muslim in the 12th century. This is from Usama ibn-Munqidh, and of course he was a Syrian Muslim nobleman who lived in close proximity to the Kingdom of Jerusalem, interacted with the Franks of Outremer pretty frequently. And the way that the Franks governed themselves was puzzling to him. He didn't understand the fact that they had this council of rulers. If you look at the Islamic world, kind of like the Byzantine world, you've got this single supreme monarch who makes the absolute decisions and cannot be questioned. And Usama, in this case, he really doesn't understand what's going on with Frankish government. He thinks that it has something to do with just being a knight. He calls out the Franks and he says, there's nobody that's important in their society but the knights. The knights make all the decisions. But he describes this incident in his memoirs, where he discusses watching the Franks carry out some justice through a council of knights. And he misinterprets it, but we do get a feel how this would have looked to an outsider who really didn't understand this conciliar and democratic form of government. So this is what he says. The Franks, may Allah render them helpless, possess none of the virtues of men except courage, consider no precedence or high rank except that of the knights, and have nobody that counts except the knights. And these are the men on whose counsel they rely, and the ones who make legal decisions and judgments. I once brought a case before them, relative to certain flocks of sheep, which the Lord of Banyas had taken from the forest in the course of a period of truce between them and us. At that time I was in Damascus. So I said to King Fulk, son of Fulk, of course that's King Fulk of Jerusalem, this man has trespassed upon our rights and taken away our flocks. At the lambing time, the sheep gave birth and the lambskins died. Then he returned the sheep, after having lost so many of them. The king said to 6 or 7 knights, arise and judge this case for him. The knights went out from this audience chamber, retired by themselves, and consulted together until they all agreed upon one thing. Then they returned to the audience chamber of the king and said, we have passed judgment to the effect that the Lord of Banyas should be fined the amount of the damage he wrought among their sheep. The king accordingly ordered him to pay that fine. He pleaded with me, urged and implored me until I finally accepted from him 400 dinars. Such a judgment, after having been pronounced by the knights, not even the king nor any of the chieftains of the Franks can alter or revoke. Thus the knight is something great in their esteem. Pretty interesting. That's from pages 93 through 94 of Usama's memoirs. Okay, a couple things to notice about this. First of all, notice how he says that after this judgment is made, nobody can alter it. This is how Western law and legal practice works. Is like you have a legal process, and once that's done, it's done. It's not like in the Oriental system, in the East, where the ruler can kind of change his mind at will. Also notice here, even though Usama, at the beginning of it, he of course, in the obligatory manner, he criticizes the Franks, says they have no virtue, but he actually went before the king of Jerusalem to seek justice. That means he trusted in their ability to render justice to him. And he got it, notice that. The Lord of Banyas, he's talking about, who had stolen these sheep from him, was a Frank. The Franks held Banyas at this time. And Usama is willing to go before Folk of Jerusalem and argue this case before him, and he expects something to come of it. He doesn't expect to just be thrown out because he's a Muslim. There you go. I mean, this is how the kingdom of Jerusalem operated. You're going to remember Ibn Jubayr a lot later is going to talk about how the Muslims came to consider the Franks' justice something they could always rely on. They had a very consistent legal system. It wasn't dependent on the will or the whim of the ruler. So this is how monarchy worked in Western European Latin civilization in the 12th and 13th centuries. As we get into the late 13th century, it's starting to change already. But at this period, in this Crusader period, this is how it operated. And it's, you can see where a lot of people think that America kind of invented these democratic traditions or these conciliar traditions, but it's really not true at all. This is a deep tradition in Western civilization. What happened was in the late Middle Ages, you see this trend where the crowned heads of Europe, the King of France, the King and Queen of Spain, the King of England, they all start to kind of consolidate power in these regions, and no longer is power kind of dispersed among the nobility, with the king as kind of a first among equals. Now, the monarchs are taking absolute control. They have the power of life and death. And it was actually something that Western Europeans were uncomfortable with, because this was not a part of their tradition. This is not how things were done traditionally. That's why you had to come up with these ideas like the divine right of kings. But this is not how it was done for centuries. So, I think that this earlier way of doing things in the High Middle Ages was considerably superior. You look at a monarch like Henry VIII, he was an insane psychopath. He killed huge numbers of people. I mean, executions happened constantly because he would throw a temper tantrum. He had absolute power and control of the Kingdom of England. He got whatever he wanted. A king couldn't do that in the 12th century. He didn't have that kind of power. And if he'd acted like that, he would have been deposed and thrown out. So when you look at this period, you do tend to see more kings who are more virtuous. I mean, the kings of Jerusalem especially. You look at the set of kings of Jerusalem in the 12th century, Outremer, and it really is an impressive set of virtuous monarchs who were just and dealt fairly with their people. And they weren't the only ones who were governing the kingdom of Jerusalem. It was governed by the high court. The role of the king in the 12th century was sort of a first among equals, kind of the first knight. He would be the arbiter, the final arbiter if there was an irresolvable dispute. He would lead the army, that kind of thing. But a campaign couldn't just be launched by the king. He had to call the council, and they would determine if it was something they were going to do. And this is an example of that. This is from William of Tyre. This is from before King Baldwin III set out on the siege of Ascalon in 1153. He called the council, and the council determined if this was going to happen. So this is what William of Tyre writes in his chronicle. Accordingly, the Lord directing their purposes, it was unanimously resolved by the wish of the least as well as the greatest, so that's the council right there, to try in some way to injure their enemies in that vicinity, who had so often brought serious trouble on them, namely the people of Ascalon. So that's how they came to determine this military policy. So I hope that answers the question for you. Thanks for listening, guys. And just kind of to summarize, the kings of Jerusalem in the 12th century, no, they could not just kill whoever they wanted. I doubt they would have wanted to. Anyway, it was a very different mindset at this period than you have later on when, when kings like Henry VIII are just obsessed with their marriages and all that kind of nonsense. So thanks very much for listening. Please subscribe to Real Crusades History if you haven't done so yet. Also, if you look in the About box and you want to support my work financially, there's a donate link. You can make a small donation through PayPal. It's very easy. And finally, on Facebook, you're going to find Real Crusades History on Facebook. The link is in the About box also, so like us there, and thanks.